At my college graduation party, my mother grabbed the microphone and said, "Before we celebrate, everyone should know what she cost me. Look at my stomach." She lifted her dress in front of 200 guests, showing the loose skin and stretch marks. 22 years ago, this ungrateful girl destroyed my modeling career. I was signed to elite management before she came along. My Aunt Rachel tried to take the microphone, but Mom pushed her away. This was supposed to be my celebration dinner at the country club after getting my nursing degree, but Mom was making it about her destroyed dreams again. She'd been drinking champagne since noon and getting louder with each glass. "You all think she's so wonderful graduating with honors, but you don't know what I sacrificed." Dad stood up from his chair looking embarrassed, but he never actually stopped her when she got like this. My boyfriend Jake squeezed my hand under the table while my grandparents stared at their plates. Mom kept going even though people were starting to leave. I could have been on magazine covers, but instead I got fat and ruined because someone decided to be born 3 weeks early. She was pointing at me now, and her voice was getting that sharp edge that meant this was going to get worse. The waiters stopped serving food and just stood against the walls watching this train wreck happen. My agent dropped me the day I told him I was pregnant. She was crying now, but not sad tears. These were angry tears that I'd seen my whole life whenever she looked at old photos of herself. Fashion Week was 2 months away, and I was booked for 8 shows. My little brother Tom, who was 19 and still lived at home, started recording on his phone. Not to post anywhere, but because we'd learned to document Mom's public meltdowns for therapy sessions. You want to know what she really cost me? Mom walked toward my table, still holding the wireless microphone. My friend group from nursing school looked horrified because they'd never seen this side of her. She was usually so charming and perfect when other people were around, saving the real venom for when we were alone. $2 million. That's what my contract was worth over 5 years. She slammed her hand on the table, making the water glasses jump. "I did the math every single year on your birthday." Jake stood up like he was going to say something, but I grabbed his arm because confronting her only made things escalate faster. "That's why you're paying me back starting next month." Everyone went quiet, and even the country club manager who'd been hovering by the door stopped moving. "What are you talking about?" I finally spoke, even though I knew engaging was a mistake. "Your signing bonus from the hospital. $30,000. That goes to me." She pulled papers from her purse and threw them on the table. I picked up the papers and saw they were some kind of contract she'd drawn up herself, not actual legal documents. "You're insane." The words came out before I could stop them. Insane? I'm a mother who gave up everything. You gotta go to college because I worked 3 jobs after my modeling career died. This was a lie. Dad paid for my college, and she hadn't worked since I was 5. You live in my house rent-free. Another lie. I'd moved out at 18 and paid for my apartment working nights at the hospital while going to school. Every gray hair and wrinkle is because of the stress you caused me by ruining my body. She turned to address the whole room again like she was giving a speech. I never got to travel to Paris or Milan, never got to date Leonardo DiCaprio. People actually laughed at that one, which made her angrier. He was at the same party as me once in 1999, and my agent said he noticed me. Aunt Rachel tried again to intervene. "Diana, you need to stop this right now." But Mom was on a roll. "She's getting married next year and expects me to pay for it when she still owes me for destroying my life." Jake looked confused because we weren't engaged and hadn't even talked about marriage yet. I found the ring receipt in Jake's car. She smiled like she'd caught us in some crime. $4,000 he spent when that money should go to compensate me. That's when Grandma stood up. She was 83 and barely 5 feet tall, but when she got mad, everyone listened. "Diana Marie Henderson, you stop this nonsense immediately." Grandma's voice cut through Mom's rant like ice. "What modeling contract? You were never signed to Elite. You did 2 local department store shoots for $50 each." Mom's face went white. "Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments." Grandma pulled out her phone and swiped through her photo gallery until she found what she was looking for. She held the screen up so everyone at our table could see. There was Mom in a JCPenney catalog from 1999 wearing junior sportswear and standing next to a rack of clearance items. The next photo showed her in Dillard's shoe department modeling discount sneakers. Both shoots were clearly local department store ads, not high-fashion modeling. The photos had price tags visible in the background and fluorescent store lighting that washed out everything. Mom looked young and pretty, but she was just a regular model for newspaper inserts, not someone signed to a major agency. Grandma scrolled to show the payment receipts she'd saved. $50 for each shoot, both dated 3 months before I was born. The country club dining room had gone so quiet I could hear the air conditioning humming and someone's fork hitting their plate across the room. My heartbeat pounded in my ears while everyone stared at the evidence on Grandma's phone. Mom's face had gone from white to red and she was breathing hard through her nose. The fake contract she'd thrown at me was still sitting on the table between us, suddenly looking even more ridiculous now that everyone knew the modeling career it referenced never existed. Mom lunged across the table reaching for Grandma's phone, but Dad finally moved. He stepped between them and grabbed Mom's arm, pulling her back. His voice was quiet, but firm when he said we needed to leave right now. Half the guests had already disappeared, probably grateful for an excuse to escape the awkwardness. The other half were staring at their dessert plates like the chocolate mousse was the most interesting thing they'd ever seen. I tried to stand up, but my legs felt wobbly and weak. Jake put his hand under my elbow and helped me get to my feet. My nursing school friends were gathering their purses and whispering to each other. The country club manager was hovering near the exit, looking stressed and probably calculating how much drama he was willing to tolerate before he kicked us all out. Tom was still recording on his phone, getting every second of Mom's meltdown for documentation. Aunt Rachel had her arm around Grandma, who was putting her phone back in her purse with shaking hands. Mom was crying now. Real tears this time instead of the angry performance tears from before. We made it to the parking lot, and that's when Mom completely lost it. She was screaming at Grandma about betrayal and humiliation, her voice echoing off the cars. Tom kept his phone up recording everything while staying a safe distance away. Dad was trying to get Mom into their car, but she kept pulling away from him and flailing her arms around. Her mascara was running down her face in thick black streaks that made her look like something from a horror movie. Her hair had come loose from the fancy updo she'd spent 2 hours getting done that morning. She kept yelling that Grandma had ruined everything and destroyed her relationship with her daughter. I just stood there next to Jake's car watching my family fall apart in front of the country club. Other guests were walking past us quickly with their heads down, pretending not to see or hear anything. A few people I recognized from Dad's work gave him sympathetic looks, but nobody stopped to help. Mom's voice was getting hoarse from screaming, but she wouldn't stop. She was saying things about how Grandma had always been jealous of her beauty, and how everyone in the family had conspired against her. Dad finally got her car door open and physically guided her into the passenger seat. She was still yelling when he closed the door and walked around to the driver's side looking 10 years older than he had at the start of dinner. Jake drove me back to my apartment and I couldn't stop shaking. My hands were trembling so hard I dropped my keys twice trying to get them in the lock. Jake took the keys from me gently and opened the door himself. Inside my apartment, everything looked normal and peaceful, which felt wrong somehow after what just happened. Jake guided me to the couch and went to make tea in my kitchen. I sat there staring at the wall trying to process the last 2 hours. 22 years of being blamed for destroying a career that never existed in the first place. 22 years of Mom looking at me with resentment and anger because she thought I'd stolen her dreams. Every birthday when she'd mentioned the modeling contract. Every time she looked in the mirror and complained about her body. Every family photo where she stood slightly apart from me like she couldn't stand to be too close. All of it was based on a lie she'd told herself so many times she actually believed it. Jake came back with 2 mugs of chamomile tea and sat down next to me. He didn't try to make me talk or tell me it would be okay. He just sat there being present while I tried to make sense of what I'd learned. I couldn't sleep that night even though I was exhausted. Jake had gone home around midnight after making sure I was okay. I kept thinking about Mom's face when Grandma showed those photos. The shock and rage and something else underneath it all. Maybe shame or fear. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up on sleeping and opened my laptop. I started Googling Elite Management Modeling Agency and their roster from 1999. The agency website was still active, and they had an archive section with photos of all their models from every year going back to the 80s. I clicked through 1998, 1999, and 2000 looking at hundreds of faces. Mom's name didn't appear anywhere. I tried searching the site directly for Diana Henderson and got 0 results. I found old modeling forums and message boards from the late 90s and searched those too. Nothing. I spent 3 hours going through archived websites and old modeling industry publications. Mom's name never came up once in any capacity. The closest I got was finding another Diana Henderson who modeled in California, but the photos showed a completely different person. By 5 in the morning, I had 20 browser tabs open and my eyes hurt from staring at the screen. But I had definitive proof that Mom had never been signed to Elite Management or any other major modeling agency. Tom showed up at my apartment at 7 in the morning, still wearing his suit from the party. His tie was loose and hanging crooked, and he had dark circles under his eyes. He was carrying his laptop tucked under one arm. I opened the door and he walked straight to my kitchen table without saying anything. He looked like he hadn't slept at all, and I probably looked the same. He set his laptop down and opened it, pulling up a folder labeled with just a date from 5 years ago. He turned the screen toward me and said we needed to talk about everything Mom had done to both of us. His voice was flat and tired. I sat down across from him and he clicked play on the first video. It was Mom in our kitchen screaming at teenage Tom about something. The date stamp showed it was from when he was 14. He had hundreds of these videos, all carefully dated and organized. He'd been documenting her meltdowns for 5 years, and I had no idea. We spent the whole morning watching videos Tom had secretly recorded since he was 14. There was Mom screaming at him for getting a B in algebra, calling him stupid and lazy. There was Mom blaming him for Dad's weight gain, saying the stress of having another child made Dad eat too much. There was Mom telling him he ruined her figure even worse than I did because he was a bigger baby. Video after video of her ranting and crying and blaming him for everything wrong in her life. I had no idea it was this bad for him too. I'd moved out at 18 and built my own life, but Tom had been stuck in that house dealing with this alone for years. Some of the videos made me cry. Some made me angry. All of them made me realize how much I'd failed to protect my little brother by focusing only on my own escape. Tom sat there watching me watch the videos with no expression on his face. He'd seen these so many times they didn't affect him anymore. He just needed me to see what he'd been living with while I was away at college building my nursing career. Tom closed the laptop and pulled out a journal from his backpack. He said he'd been in therapy for 2 years without telling our parents. His therapist had been helping him document the abuse systematically. He opened the journal, and I saw pages and pages of entries in Tom's neat handwriting. Each entry had a date, a description of what Mom did or said, and how it made him feel. There were entries about her blaming us for things that weren't our fault, entries about her making up stories about her past and getting angry when anyone questioned them, entries about her comparing us to the imaginary children she could have had if we hadn't ruined her body and career. There were hundreds of entries going back 2 years. Tom's therapist had taught him to write everything down as it happened, so he'd have a clear record instead of just painful memories. He flipped through the pages, showing me the pattern. Mom's behavior had gotten worse over time, not better. The lies had gotten bigger and more detailed. The blame had gotten more intense. Tom said his therapist called it narcissistic personality disorder, with possible delusional thinking. He said we'd both been victims of emotional abuse our entire lives. My phone started buzzing on the table, and I looked at the screen. 37 missed calls from Mom and Dad. I picked it up and saw the voicemail notifications piling up. I put it on speaker and played the first one. Mom was crying and apologizing, saying she didn't mean any of it and everyone just misunderstood. The second voicemail was angrier. She was saying I embarrassed her in front of everyone and I should have defended her against Grandma's lies. The third one was even worse. She was screaming about how ungrateful I was after everything she sacrificed. The voicemails got progressively more unhinged until around number 20 when Dad's voice took over. He sounded tired and was asking me to please just call back so we could talk like adults and work this out. He said Mom was very upset and needed to hear from me. He said family was important and we couldn't let one bad night destroy our relationships. I listened to all 37 voicemails while Tom sat across from me. When the last one finished, I picked up my phone and deleted every single one without responding. Tom nodded like he understood completely. Jake came back over around noon with 2 bags of groceries. He let himself in with the spare key I'd given him months ago and found Tom and me sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by evidence. Tom's laptop was open, showing a paused video of Mom mid-rant. His journal was spread out with entries visible. My own laptop had 20 tabs open about modeling agencies. My phone was face down on the table after I'd finally turned off the ringer. Jake took in the whole scene and didn't say anything. He just started unpacking the groceries and making lunch for all of us. He'd brought sandwich stuff and fruit and chips, easy food that didn't require much thought. He didn't say I told you so, even though he'd been gently suggesting for months that Mom's treatment of me wasn't normal. He'd met her a dozen times and seen how she acted. The fake sweetness in public and the little cutting comments when she thought nobody else was listening. He'd asked me careful questions about my childhood and listened when I brushed them off. Now he was just being present and making sure Tom and I ate something because we'd both forgotten food existed. He made 3 turkey sandwiches and brought them to the table with bottles of water. Tom and I ate mechanically while Jake sat with us in supportive silence. Around 2 in the afternoon, my phone started buzzing on the coffee table where I'd left it face down. Jake picked it up and looked at the screen before handing it to me. Aunt Rachel was calling, which was unusual because she normally just texted. I answered and heard her voice sounding steadier than I expected after everything that happened. She asked if I was okay and actually waited for me to answer instead of jumping in with her own opinions. I told her I was still processing everything, and she said that was completely normal after what Mom put me through at the party. She explained that Grandma was fine but pretty shaken up by the whole confrontation and was resting at her house. Rachel said she'd wanted to expose Mom's lies for years, but never found the right moment until Grandma just couldn't take it anymore. We talked for almost 20 minutes and she kept checking in on how I was feeling instead of making excuses for Mom's behavior. Before we hung up, she told me to call her anytime I needed to talk and that she was proud of me for graduating despite everything Mom had put me through. After the call ended, I felt this weird mix of relief and sadness because it was nice having an adult in my family actually care about my feelings. Monday morning came too fast, and I had to get ready for my first real shift at the hospital as an official nurse instead of a student. I stood in my bathroom brushing my teeth and staring at my reflection, wondering if Mom would actually show up and cause a scene. My hands were shaking as I put on my scrubs, and I kept checking my phone for messages, even though I knew I shouldn't engage with her. Jake had stayed over Sunday night and he made me breakfast before I left, but I could barely eat anything. The drive to the hospital took 15 minutes, and I spent the whole time rehearsing what I would say to my supervisor about the family situation. When I got to the nurse's station, my supervisor Linda was already there reviewing patient charts. I asked if I could talk to her privately for a minute, and we stepped into the break room. I explained as calmly as I could that there was some family drama happening, and my mother might try to contact me at work. Linda didn't ask for details, which I appreciated, and just said to let her know immediately if there were any problems. She also reminded me that hospital security was very good at handling situations like this, if it became necessary. I thanked her and tried to focus on my actual job for the rest of the shift. Mom didn't show up in person, but around 10 that morning, the main reception desk called up to our floor. The receptionist said someone claiming to be my mother had called asking to be transferred to me directly. I told the receptionist that personal calls weren't allowed during my shift, unless it was a genuine emergency. About an hour later, reception called again saying the same woman had called back, then again at noon, and once more at 2. By the fourth call, the receptionist sounded annoyed and told me she'd informed the caller that personal calls required emergency status. Apparently, Mom claimed it was an emergency, but when pressed, couldn't explain what the actual emergency was. The receptionist said she'd blocked the number from calling the main line again and logged it in case there were future issues. I felt embarrassed that Mom was already causing problems at my new job, but also grateful that the hospital staff was taking it seriously. My phone buzzed during my break and I saw a text from Tom. He said Mom had completely lost it when he got home from my apartment Sunday night. She'd demanded his phone so she could delete all the videos he'd recorded, but he refused to give it to her. Tom had already backed everything up to the cloud anyway, so even if she got his phone, the evidence would still exist. Mom tried to ground him, which was ridiculous since he was 19 years old and about to start his sophomore year of college. She also threatened to take away his car, even though Dad had bought it for him and put it in Tom's name. The text said he was seriously looking at apartments near campus for next semester because he couldn't deal with her anymore. I texted back that I would help him look for places and maybe even help with rent if he needed it. Having Tom still living at home with Mom felt dangerous now that everything was out in the open. Wednesday afternoon, my phone rang with Dad's number, which caught me off guard because he never called during work hours. I was on my lunch break sitting in my car in the hospital parking lot eating a sandwich. His voice sounded tired and older somehow when I answered. He asked if we could meet for coffee to talk without Mom being present. I felt suspicious immediately because Dad usually went along with whatever Mom wanted, and I couldn't figure out his angle. But I was also curious about what he'd say when she wasn't controlling the conversation. We agreed to meet Thursday at a coffee shop near the hospital during my lunch break. Thursday, I got to the coffee shop 10 minutes early and ordered a latte while I waited. Dad showed up right on time, looking more worn out than I'd ever seen him. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper, and his hair looked grayer than it had at graduation just 5 days ago. We sat at a corner table away from other people, and he stirred his black coffee for a long time before speaking. He admitted he'd always known Mom exaggerated about her modeling career, but didn't realize she'd built it up to this extreme level in her own mind. He said watching Grandma expose the truth in front of everyone made him see how bad things had gotten. Dad apologized for not protecting Tom and me better over the years, and his voice actually cracked a little when he said it. I wanted to believe him, but I'd heard similar things before that never led to actual change. I asked him directly why he never stopped Mom when she went on her rants about how we ruined her life. Dad looked down at his coffee cup and didn't have a good answer ready. He talked about wanting to keep the peace and thinking she'd eventually grow out of it. He mentioned that his own mother had been difficult and demanding, so he'd learned early to just stay quiet and avoid conflict. Listening to him make excuses, I realized he'd been enabling Mom's behavior for decades. Every time he looked embarrassed but didn't intervene, he was choosing her feelings over our safety. Every time he let her blame us for her unhappiness, he was teaching us that we deserved it. I told him that staying quiet wasn't the same as being innocent, and he nodded, but I don't think he fully understood what I meant. We finished our coffee and he asked if we could meet again next week. I said maybe, but I needed time to think about what kind of relationship I could have with him going forward. That night, I couldn't sleep, so I started going through old family photos and documents in boxes I'd brought from home years ago. I pulled out Mom's high school yearbook from 1994 and flipped through every page looking for any mention of modeling or fashion clubs. She wasn't in any of them. The only club she'd been part of was drama club sophomore year, and she wasn't even in any of the production photos. I found her college transcripts from the community college she'd attended for one semester before dropping out. She'd taken basic courses like English and math and gotten mostly C's. Nothing about fashion or modeling or anything that supported her stories. I kept digging through papers and found old tax returns from the years after I was born. No income listed for modeling work or any kind of entertainment industry employment. Dad's income was listed, but Mom's section was blank year after year. Every piece of evidence I found proved that the career she'd blamed me for destroying had never existed in the first place. Friday evening, Grandma showed up at my apartment carrying 2 big boxes of old family photos and papers. She said she'd been waiting for the right time to show me the truth about Mom's past, and now seemed like that moment. We spread everything out on my living room floor and spent hours going through it while Grandma told me stories. She showed me photos of Mom as a teenager looking normal and pretty, but not like someone being scouted by modeling agencies. There were pictures from Mom's brief time in community college where she looked happy and regular. Grandma pointed out that in all the family photos from the late 90s, Mom was already creating dramatic stories about missed opportunities and people who'd wronged her. She explained that Mom had always been dramatic and attention-seeking even as a child, but it wasn't harmful back then. After Grandma left around 10 that night, I sat surrounded by evidence of who my mother really was, versus who she'd told me she was my entire life. Grandma came back Saturday morning with coffee and bagels, and we continued going through the boxes. She explained that Mom's behavior got significantly worse after she had me. The pregnancy had been difficult, and Mom gained 60 pounds, which was normal, but she fixated on it. Instead of accepting that her body had changed like most women's bodies do after having a baby, she started creating this fantasy about a stolen modeling career. Grandma said she tried to get Mom into therapy back then, but Mom refused and got angry at the suggestion. Over the years, the fantasy grew bigger and more detailed until Mom seemed to actually believe it herself. Grandma showed me the actual modeling portfolio Mom had put together in 1999. It contained exactly 4 photos. The 2 department store shoots Grandma had mentioned at the party. One basic headshot that looked like it came from Sears Portrait Studio. And 1 photo from a local car show where Mom was standing next to a red Corvette wearing jeans and a tank top. That was it. That was the entire modeling career she'd been talking about for 22 years. 4 photos and 2 $50 paychecks. I held the thin portfolio in my hands and felt this strange combination of anger and sadness because she'd built her entire identity and all of her resentment toward me on something that barely existed. I stared at the thin portfolio, feeling this weird mix of anger and sadness wash over me because my entire childhood had been shaped by something that barely existed. 22 years of being told I destroyed her dreams, and it was all based on 4 photos and $100 total. Grandma packed up the boxes and hugged me before she left, telling me she was proud of me for finally seeing the truth. I couldn't sleep that night, so I just sat on my couch looking at those 4 photos over and over, trying to understand how someone builds an entire identity around nothing. Tom showed up at my apartment the next afternoon, still wearing his work uniform from the grocery store where he had a summer job. He looked exhausted and dropped onto my couch without even saying hello first. I made him coffee and waited for him to talk because I could tell something was bothering him. He pulled out his phone and showed me a text from his therapist, asking if he'd be willing to do a family session with Mom and Dad. His therapist thought it might help everyone communicate better and start healing the family dynamics. Tom laughed when he read it out loud, and it wasn't a happy laugh. He said there was no way Mom would ever agree to therapy, because that would mean admitting she had a problem. I agreed with him, but part of me wondered if the graduation party disaster had shaken her enough to consider it. Tom shook his head and told me he'd already made his decision about something else. He was moving out for fall semester, and he'd been saving money from his grocery store job specifically, so Mom couldn't use finances to control him. He had almost $3,000 saved up, and his roommate situation was already arranged. I felt proud of him and guilty at the same time, because I'd escaped to my own apartment years ago, but left him alone in that house. Tom said he wasn't mad at me for leaving and that he understood I had to save myself first. We talked for 2 hours about his plans and how he was going to tell Mom and Dad. He decided to wait until mid-August, right before move-in day, so she'd have less time to sabotage his plans or guilt trip him into staying. My phone rang 2 days later from a number I didn't recognize with my area code. I almost didn't answer because I thought it might be Mom calling from someone else's phone to get around me ignoring her calls. But something made me pick up, and a woman's voice introduced herself as Jake's mom. She said Jake had told her what happened at my graduation party, and she wanted to reach out directly. I felt embarrassed that Jake's family knew about my disaster of a mother, but she was really kind about it. She explained that she was a family law attorney, and her practice focused on cases involving parental abuse and financial exploitation. She'd seen situations like mine before, and wanted me to know I had options for protecting myself legally. She offered to review the fake contract Mom had drawn up, demanding my signing bonus if I wanted to send her photos of it. I thanked her and said I'd think about it. But honestly, I was overwhelmed by the idea of involving lawyers. After we hung up, Jake texted me asking if his mom had called and if I was okay with him telling her what happened. I told him it was fine and that his mom seemed really nice. He said she'd been wanting to help since he told her about the country club incident, and she dealt with narcissistic parents in her cases all the time. That night, I pulled out the fake contract Mom had thrown on the table at the party. I'd shoved it in my desk drawer and tried to forget about it, but now I looked at it more carefully. It was typed up on regular computer paper and had places for signatures at the bottom. The language was ridiculous and not even close to real legal writing. It basically said I owed Mom $2 million for destroying her modeling career, and that my hospital signing bonus would be the first payment toward this debt. There were clauses about future payments and interest rates and penalties if I refused to pay. I took photos of all 3 pages and texted them to Jake asking for his mom's email address. He sent it right away, and I forwarded the photos before I could change my mind. I felt nervous involving someone I'd never met in my family problems, but I also felt relieved that maybe someone who understood the law could tell me if I needed to worry about this insane document. Jake's mom called me back in less than an hour, and I could hear her laughing before she even started talking. She said the contract was completely unenforceable and had no legal standing whatsoever. She explained that you can't just make up debts that don't exist and demand payment through a homemade contract. She said if Mom actually tried to pursue this through any legal channels, she could face consequences for attempted fraud or extortion. I felt this huge weight lift off my shoulders because part of me had been worried that somehow Mom could actually force me to give her my signing bonus. Jake's mom said she'd be happy to write a formal letter explaining why the contract was invalid if I needed documentation. She also suggested I might want to consider other legal protections depending on how Mom behaved going forward. I thanked her about 10 times, and she told me to call her anytime if I had questions, or if Mom escalated her behavior. Going to work at the hospital became my favorite part of each day, because Mom couldn't reach me there, and I was actually good at my job. The patients liked me, and my coworkers were friendly and normal. Nobody screamed about destroyed modeling careers or demanded money I didn't owe them. It was just regular work where I helped people and felt useful. My supervisor noticed I seemed stressed during my second week and pulled me aside during lunch break. She asked if everything was okay at home, and I gave her a brief version of the graduation party situation. She was really understanding and told me about the hospital's employee assistance program that included free counseling sessions for staff members. She said a lot of nurses used the program because healthcare work was stressful, and sometimes personal life got complicated too. She gave me a card with the contact information and said I put the card in my locker and thought about it for the rest of my shift. I called the Employee Assistance Program number the next morning and got scheduled with a therapist named Maeve Harding for the following week. The receptionist said Maeve specialized in family trauma and relationship issues. I felt nervous about the appointment all week because I'd never been to therapy before and didn't know what to expect. When I finally sat down in Maeve's office, she had kind eyes and a calm voice that made me feel less anxious. She asked me to tell her what brought me in, and I started explaining about the graduation party. Before I knew it, I was crying and couldn't stop. I cried for 40 minutes straight while telling her about Mom's public meltdown, and Grandma exposing her lies and the fake contract, and how I'd spent 22 years being blamed for destroying a career that never existed. Maeve handed me tissues and let me cry without trying to make me stop or telling me it wasn't that bad. When I finally calmed down enough to breathe normally, she said what I was describing sounded like textbook narcissistic personality disorder with long-term emotional abuse. She explained that narcissistic parents often create elaborate fantasy narratives to justify their behavior and maintain control over their children. Hearing someone with professional training validate that this wasn't normal and wasn't my fault made me cry all over again. Maeve and I met every week after that first session, and she helped me understand things I'd never seen clearly before. She explained that the public humiliation at graduation wasn't actually the main problem. It was just the moment when the dysfunction became visible to everyone else. She said I'd been living with this abuse my entire life, and only now was I starting to recognize it for what it really was. She helped me see patterns in Mom's behavior, like how she isolated me from friends who questioned her treatment of me, how she sabotaged my confidence by constantly reminding me I'd ruined her life, how she made everything about her suffering no matter what was happening to anyone else. Maeve said these were classic narcissistic control tactics, and that Mom had probably learned them from her own mother, based on what Grandma had told me. Understanding the psychology behind Mom's behavior didn't make it hurt less, but it helped me stop blaming myself. I started to realize that nothing I'd ever done could have prevented Mom from acting this way, because the problem was inside her, not because of anything I did by being born. Tom showed up at my apartment late one night around 11 without texting first. I opened the door and he looked terrible, like he'd been crying for hours. He came inside and sat on my couch and just stared at the wall for a few minutes. I made him tea and waited because I could tell he needed to say something difficult. Finally, he told me something he'd never told anyone before. When he was 16, Mom got really drunk one night after Dad went to bed early. Tom was doing homework in the kitchen and Mom came in and started one of her rants about how her life had been destroyed. But this time she said something new. She told Tom she wished she'd had an abortion with him too, because at least then she could have gotten her body back faster after having me. She said 2 kids had completely destroyed any chance she had of getting her modeling career back on track. Tom said he just sat there frozen while she kept talking about how much she regretted having children. He'd been carrying that conversation around for 3 years and never told his therapist or dad or anyone. He said he recorded it on his phone like he recorded all her meltdowns, but he'd never been able to watch the video again. I moved over to the couch and put my arms around Tom while he cried into my shoulder. I kept saying I was so sorry over and over because I didn't know what else to say. I felt like the worst sister in the world for being so focused on my own survival that I didn't see how bad it was for him. Tom pulled away and said it wasn't my job to protect him from our own mother. He said we were both just kids trying to deal with a parent who should never have had children in the first place. We sat there for a long time not talking, just being together in our shared understanding of what it was like growing up in that house. Before Tom left, we made a pact to support each other going forward no matter what happened with Mom and Dad. We promised to be honest with each other about how we were doing, and to not let Mom's manipulation drive us apart. Tom said having me as a sister was the only good thing that came out of being born into this family, and that made me cry again. Aunt Rachel called me a few days later and invited Tom and me to dinner at her house without our parents. She said she wanted to talk to us about some family history we should know. We drove over on a Saturday evening and she had a nice meal prepared. After we ate, she brought out old photo albums and started telling us stories about growing up with Diana. She explained that their mother, who was our other grandmother, had died when I was 3, so I barely remembered her. Rachel said their mother was also narcissistic and emotionally abusive, just like Mom was now. She told us about how Grandma would fly into rages over nothing and blame her daughters for ruining her life. She said Diana had learned these patterns from their mother and was now repeating them with Tom and me. Rachel showed us photos of their mother looking angry in almost every picture, even at family celebrations. She said she'd spent years in therapy dealing with the damage from her childhood, and that's why she'd kept some distance from Diana as an adult. She could see the same patterns emerging and didn't want to enable them or expose her own kids to that toxicity. Learning about the generational trauma helped me understand where Mom's behavior came from, but Rachel was clear that understanding wasn't the same as excusing it. She said Diana had choices about how to treat her own children, and she'd chosen to continue the cycle of abuse instead of breaking it. Rachel hugged us both before we left and told us to call her anytime we needed someone to talk to, who understood what Diana was really like. She said she'd been waiting years for Tom and me to be old enough to see the truth about our mother, instead of believing all her stories. The drive back to my apartment felt different because now I understood that Mom's behavior wasn't just about me or Tom, but was part of a pattern that went back generations. Jake asked if I was okay, and I told him I felt like I'd been given permission to protect myself without feeling guilty about it. Rachel's support meant everything because she knew exactly what growing up with someone like Diana was like, and she'd gotten out. I worked a 12-hour shift at the hospital 3 days later and was checking vitals on a patient in the cardiac unit when my supervisor appeared in the doorway looking uncomfortable. She asked if I could step into the hallway for a moment, and my stomach dropped because I knew something was wrong. She told me quietly that there was a situation in the lobby involving my mother and security had it handled, but I should probably stay on this floor until it was resolved. I felt my face go hot and asked what happened. My supervisor explained that Diana had shown up demanding to see me immediately, and when the front desk said they couldn't interrupt me during patient care, she started yelling about how I'd stolen money from her, and the hospital was harboring a thief. Security escorted her out, but she was still in the parking lot making a scene. I thanked my supervisor and told her I was sorry she had to deal with this. She was kind about it and said family situations happen, and the important thing was that I was safe at work. She suggested I take my break in the staff lounge on the 3rd floor instead of going outside like I usually did. I went straight to the supply closet on the cardiac floor instead, and sat on the floor between boxes of gauze and medical tape trying to breathe normally. My hands were shaking, and I could feel a panic attack coming on because Mom had found a way to invade the one place I felt competent and in control. I pulled out my phone and texted Tom what happened, and he responded immediately saying he was documenting everything, and we needed to talk to a lawyer soon. Jake called during his lunch break, and I told him what happened while sitting in that supply closet. He offered to come pick me up early, but I said no, because I wasn't going to let Mom make me leave work. I finished my shift, but I felt jumpy every time someone walked past me in the hallway. Josephina from HR called me into her office first thing the next morning. She was probably in her 50s with kind eyes, but her voice was all business when she asked me to sit down. She said the hospital took employee safety very seriously, and they needed to understand what was happening with my family situation. I explained everything while she took notes on her computer. The graduation party meltdown, the fake contract demanding my signing bonus, the years of emotional abuse that Tom and I had documented, Grandma exposing Mom's lies about her modeling career. Josephina listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked if there was a restraining order in place. I said not yet, but I was considering it. She nodded and said that was probably a good idea given the escalating behavior. Josephina pulled up something on her computer and started typing. She explained they were going to flag Diana's name in their security system so she couldn't get past the lobby anymore without triggering an alert. They were also adding a detailed note to my employee file about the situation, so if anything else happened, there would be a paper trail. She handed me a folder with information about the hospital's employee assistance program, which included free counseling sessions and legal consultation services. She said I should seriously consider talking to a lawyer about protecting myself legally, because what my mother did yesterday could be considered harassment and attempted interference with my employment. I took the folder and thanked her for handling everything so professionally. She told me to come directly to her if Diana tried anything else, and to not hesitate to call security if I felt unsafe. I made an appointment with Antoine Dyer, the family lawyer Josephina recommended, for the end of the week. His office was in a building downtown near the courthouse, and when I walked in carrying a folder full of Tom's videos and documentation, I felt like I was taking my life seriously for the first time. Antoine was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, and he had me sit down and tell him everything from the beginning. I showed him the videos Tom had recorded over the years, the fake contract Mom created demanding my signing bonus, witness statements from people at the graduation party, and the hospital documentation of her showing up at my workplace. He watched 3 of the videos without saying anything, and I could see his jaw getting tighter as Mom's voice filled his office. Antoine said we definitely had grounds for a restraining order if I wanted to pursue one. He explained the process would take a few weeks and require a court hearing where both sides could present evidence. He also suggested documenting everything going forward because based on the pattern he was seeing, Mom would likely escalate further before she backed down. He asked if Tom would be willing to testify if it came to that, and I said yes. Antoine told me to think about whether I was ready to take this legal step, because once we filed, there would be no going back, and it would probably make Mom angrier in the short term. I told him I'd talk to Tom and Jake and get back to him within a week. He said that was fine and to call him immediately if Mom did anything else threatening or showed up at my work again. Dad called me that evening, and his voice sounded strained when he asked if we could please just have dinner as a family and talk things through like adults. I sat on my couch staring at my phone and told him I would consider it only if Mom agreed to 3 conditions. She had to acknowledge that the modeling career was exaggerated, and she was never signed to elite management. She had to apologize publicly for humiliating me at my graduation party in front of 200 people. And she had to agree to start family therapy with a licensed professional. Dad was quiet for a long time and then said he would talk to her about it. I told him those conditions were non-negotiable, and if she refused even one of them, I wasn't interested in having dinner or any other family gathering. He said he understood and would call me back in a couple days. Dad called back 2 days later, and I could tell from his voice what the answer was before he said anything. Mom refused all 3 conditions. She was claiming that Grandma had lied about the modeling photos because she was jealous of Diana's beauty and success. She said I was manipulated by Jake's family who wanted to turn me against her, so they could control me. And she was now saying that I was the narcissist and she was the victim of my cruel treatment. Dad sounded exhausted when he repeated all this, and asked if there was any way I could be flexible on the conditions. I told him no, and that I was done trying to have a relationship with someone who couldn't acknowledge basic facts about reality. He started to argue, but I cut him off and said I had to go. After I hung up, I texted Tom that we needed to move forward with the restraining order. Tom moved into an apartment near his college campus 3 weeks earlier than he'd originally planned. He found 2 roommates through a campus housing board and signed the lease using money he'd saved from his summer job at the grocery store. Mom found out where the apartment was somehow and showed up on moving day screaming about betrayal through the front door. Tom's roommate opened the door and Mom pushed past him into the living room, demanding to know why her son was abandoning her. Tom stood there holding a box of his stuff and told her calmly to leave or he would call the police. She started crying and saying he was breaking her heart just like I had broken it. One of Tom's roommates stepped forward and said very clearly that she needed to leave the property immediately or they would call the cops. Mom looked around at the 3 of them and must have realized she wasn't going to win this one because she left still yelling about ungrateful children. Tom texted me an hour later saying he felt free for the first time in his entire life. My first session with Maeve the therapist turned into weekly appointments because there was so much to process. She helped me see patterns I'd never recognized before. How Mom isolated me from friends who questioned her behavior by making me feel guilty for spending time away from family. How she sabotaged my confidence by constantly pointing out my flaws while praising herself. How she made everything about her suffering, so I learned to minimize my own feelings and needs. Maeve showed me examples from my own stories of how Mom would twist situations to make herself the victim, even when she was clearly the aggressor. I felt angry at myself for not seeing it sooner, but Maeve said that was normal because children are programmed to trust their parents, and it takes years to recognize abuse when it comes from someone who's supposed to love you. Josefina called me into her office again a week later, and my stomach dropped because I assumed Mom had done something else. I walked in expecting bad news, but Josefina was almost smiling when she told me to sit down. She said Mom had called the hospital administrator directly claiming I had stolen money from her and demanding my signing bonus be given to her instead of me. The administrator had apparently laughed and told her that wasn't how employment contracts worked, and if she called again, they would consider it harassment. Josefina said they were documenting this call along with everything else, and it actually strengthened my case if I decided to pursue legal action. I sat there feeling a weird mix of relief that the administrator had shut Mom down and horror that she was still trying to sabotage my job and my money. Josefina told me this behavior showed clear escalation, and I should really consider that restraining order sooner rather than later. I walked straight from Josefina's office to my car and sat there shaking for 5 minutes before I could even put the key in the ignition. Mom calling the hospital administrator to try to get my signing bonus redirected to her was beyond anything I'd imagined she would do. She wasn't just embarrassing me at family events anymore. She was actively trying to sabotage my career and steal my money. I pulled out my phone and found the business card Antoine had given me weeks ago when Josefina first suggested I might need legal protection. My hands were still trembling as I dialed his number. He answered on the second ring, and I told him everything that had just happened. Antoine listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said we had more than enough evidence now for a restraining order. The hospital documentation of Mom's repeated attempts to contact me at work, the administrator's record of her demanding my signing bonus, Tom's videos from the graduation party, witness statements from 200 guests who saw her public meltdown. He said he could start the paperwork immediately if I was ready to move forward. I told him yes without hesitation. Something had shifted in me sitting in that parking lot. I wasn't scared anymore. I was angry and protective of the life I'd built for myself. That evening, Jake came over to my apartment with takeout and found me sitting on the couch surrounded by paperwork Antoine had emailed me to review and sign. Jake set the food down and asked if I was okay, and I realized I'd been so focused on handling this alone that I hadn't really let him help. He sat down next to me and asked if I wanted him to talk to his mom about the legal situation since she specialized in family law. I looked at him and felt something release in my chest. I'd been trying to protect him from the full extent of my family's dysfunction, but he was offering to help, and I needed to let him. I said yes, and he immediately pulled out his phone to text her. Within 20 minutes, his mom had called me directly and spent an hour on the phone going through every detail of Mom's behavior. She said she knew Antoine professionally and he was excellent at these cases. She also offered to consult on my case for free if Antoine needed a second opinion on anything. After we hung up, Jake ordered me to eat the now cold Chinese food and told me I didn't have to be strong all the time. I cried for the first time since the graduation party, and he just held me while I let it all out. 2 days later, Aunt Rachel called me at work during my lunch break. Her voice sounded tired when she told me that Mom was calling every relative she could think of with a completely different version of what happened at my graduation party. According to Mom's story, I'd had too much to drink and started screaming at her for no reason. Then Grandma had joined in to gang up on her, and now I was trying to destroy her reputation over a simple misunderstanding. Rachel said some of the relatives who hadn't been at the party were believing Mom's version because they'd never seen her dark side. But Rachel was calling everyone back and setting the record straight with anyone who would listen. She was telling them about the fake contract demanding my signing bonus, about Mom showing up at the hospital, about the 22 years of blaming me for a modeling career that never existed. Rachel said the family was splitting into sides and it was getting ugly, but she wanted me to know she had my back no matter what. I thanked her and told her I was pursuing a restraining order. There was a long pause, and then Rachel said she thought that was probably the healthiest thing I could do for myself. She said she'd wished she'd done the same thing with their mother years ago before she died. That night, I opened my email and found a long message from Grandma with the subject line, "Family history you should know." I made myself a cup of tea and settled in to read it. Grandma explained that Mom's father, my grandfather, who died of a heart attack 2 years before I was born, had been a severe alcoholic who raged at everyone in the house. He would come home drunk and scream at Grandma and the girls for hours about how they'd ruined his life and trapped him in a boring job when he could have been something important. Mom and Rachel grew up walking on eggshells, never knowing what would set him off. Grandma wrote that Mom learned early that creating dramatic stories about herself got her positive attention from teachers and friends, while the truth of her home life was too painful to share. Mom would tell elaborate lies about family vacations they never took and achievements that never happened. After her father died, Mom seemed to get worse instead of better. She started blaming other people for everything wrong in her life instead of dealing with her own pain and trauma. Grandma said she'd watched Mom use this pattern for 40 years, and it had destroyed most of her relationships. She'd tried to get Mom into therapy dozens of times, but Mom always refused because that would mean admitting something was wrong with her. Grandma ended the email by saying she loved her daughter, but she also knew Mom had hurt me deeply, and I had every right to protect myself. I brought Grandma's email to my therapy session with Maeve the next week. Maeve read it carefully, and then looked at me and asked how I felt learning this family history. I told her it helped me understand why Mom was the way she was, but I wasn't sure what to do with that understanding. Maeve nodded and said something that stuck with me. She said understanding where someone's damage comes from doesn't mean you have to accept their abuse. She said I could have compassion for the trauma Mom experienced as a child while still protecting myself from her current behavior. Those two things weren't opposites. I could acknowledge that Mom was hurt and also acknowledge that she'd spent 22 years hurting me. Maeve said this concept was hard for a lot of people to grasp, because we're taught that understanding someone means forgiving them and staying in relationship with them. But actually, the healthiest thing is often to understand why someone is harmful and then create distance from them anyway. This felt huge to me. I'd been carrying guilt about not being more sympathetic to whatever Mom had gone through, but Maeve was giving me permission to protect myself regardless of Mom's past pain. 3 weeks after I'd met with Antoine, he called to tell me the restraining order hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after the graduation party incident. He spent an hour on the phone preparing me for what to expect. He said Mom would likely show up with her own lawyer and her own story painting herself as a victim. He warned me that she might cry and play to the judge's sympathy. But he also said our evidence was extremely strong. We had the hospital documentation from Josephina showing multiple attempts by Mom to contact me at work, and her call to the administrator demanding my signing bonus. We had Tom's videos from the graduation party and years of other recorded incidents. We had witness statements from people at the party, including the country club manager. We had the fake contract Mom had drawn up. Antoine said judges see through narcissistic behavior patterns pretty quickly, especially when there's this much documentation. He told me to stay calm during the hearing and just answer questions honestly. He said this wasn't about punishing Mom or getting revenge. It was about establishing legal boundaries to protect my safety and peace of mind going forward. The night before the hearing, Dad called me and I almost didn't answer. When I did pick up, he was crying. So hard I could barely understand him. He begged me not to go through with the restraining order. He said it would humiliate Mom publicly and destroy what was left of our family. He said people would talk about us and judge us, and Mom would never recover from the shame. I listened to him cry for a few minutes, and then I said something I'd been thinking about for weeks. I told him Mom had destroyed our family herself over the course of 22 years of emotional abuse and manipulation. I told him I was just protecting myself now, and if that caused her shame, maybe she should have thought about that before she spent 2 decades blaming me for ruining her imaginary modeling career. I told him he'd enabled her behavior by never standing up to her, and now he was trying to enable it again by asking me to sacrifice my well-being for her comfort. Dad went completely silent. After a long pause, he said he didn't know what to say to that. I told him he didn't need to say anything, but I was going to the hearing tomorrow, and I was getting that restraining order. Then I hung up before he could argue anymore. I barely slept that night. I kept playing out different scenarios in my head of what might happen at the courthouse. Jake stayed over and kept reminding me that I had people on my side, and I wasn't doing this alone. Tom had already confirmed he was coming as a witness, and he'd prepared a statement about years of similar behavior from Mom. Jake was coming for support even though he couldn't testify since he'd only known our family for 8 months. Aunt Rachel and Grandma were both planning to be there. Antoine had told me that having family members willing to testify against Mom would be powerful for the judge to see. I got up at 5 in the morning and tried to eat breakfast, but my stomach was in knots. Jake made me toast and sat with me while I picked at it. He reminded me what Antoine had said. This wasn't about punishing Mom. This was about establishing legal boundaries to protect my safety and peace. I repeated that to myself like a mantra while I got dressed in the conservative outfit Antoine had suggested I wear to court. The courthouse was cold and institutional with that particular smell of floor cleaner and old paper that all government buildings seem to have. Mom showed up dressed in a black dress like she was attending a funeral, and she was already crying when she walked in. She'd brought Dad and 2 family friends who I recognized from church, but who hadn't been at my graduation party. They didn't know the full story, and Mom had clearly recruited them to make her look sympathetic. I had Tom and Jake and Grandma and Aunt Rachel and Antoine. We sat on opposite sides of the hallway outside the courtroom waiting to be called in. Mom kept looking over at us and crying louder whenever she thought the bailiff was watching. Tom leaned over and whispered that she was performing and I shouldn't let it get to me. The judge finally called us in and he looked tired before anyone had even said a word. He was probably in his 60s with gray hair and reading glasses, and the expression of someone who'd seen every family drama possible. Antoine and Mom's lawyer introduced themselves, and then the judge asked Antoine to present our case first. Antoine stood up and laid out everything in a calm, methodical way that made it sound even worse than I'd remembered. He started with the graduation party incident, describing how Mom had grabbed the microphone at my celebration dinner and publicly humiliated me in front of 200 guests by claiming I'd destroyed her modeling career and demanding I pay her back with my signing bonus. He presented witness statements from 5 people who'd been at the party, including the country club manager. Then he moved to the hospital harassment, showing the documentation from Josephina about Mom's repeated attempts to contact me at work, including calling 4 times in one day. And finally calling the hospital administrator directly to demand my signing bonus be given to her instead of me. He showed the judge the fake contract Mom had drawn up with no legal basis demanding $30,000. Then he called Tom to testify. Tom walked up to the witness stand looking nervous but determined. He told the judge about growing up with Mom's constant emotional abuse and blame. He described how she'd told him when he was 16 that she wished she'd had an abortion so she could have gotten her body back faster. He showed the judge 3 videos on his phone of Mom having similar public meltdowns over the years. Mom's lawyer objected, saying the videos were out of context, but the judge overruled him and watched all 3 clips. Mom's face went from fake crying to real anger as she watched Tom testify against her. She started to stand up, but her lawyer grabbed her arm and pulled her back down. The judge looked at her and warned her about courtroom behavior. Then Antoine rested our case, and it was Mom's lawyer's turn. Mom's lawyer stood up and tried to paint her as a concerned parent who just wanted to make sure I was being financially responsible. He talked about how hard it was to watch your child struggle, and how Mom had sacrificed everything for her family. He made it sound like the graduation party was just an emotional moment where she'd had too much champagne and said things she didn't mean. He claimed the hospital calls were just Mom trying to understand my benefits package because she wanted to help me plan for the future. The judge looked unimpressed and kept glancing at the stack of evidence Antoine had presented. Mom's lawyer called her to testify, and she walked up to the stand dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. She talked about her difficult pregnancy and how she'd given up modeling opportunities to focus on being a mother. She said the department store shoots Grandma mentioned were just small jobs she did while waiting for her elite contract to be finalized. The judge interrupted her and asked for documentation of this elite contract. Mom said she didn't have the paperwork anymore because it was lost in a move 20 years ago. The judge asked if she had any other proof like correspondence with the agency or pay stubs. Mom started crying harder and said everything was verbal back then, and she trusted her agent. Antoine stood up and presented printouts from Elite Management's archived client roster from 1998 through 2001. Mom's name wasn't on any of the lists. The judge asked Mom directly if she'd called the hospital trying to get my signing bonus redirected to her account. Mom's face went pale and she started to say no. But then the judge held up phone records that Josephina had provided showing 4 calls from Mom's number to the hospital administrator's direct line. Mom changed her story fast and said she was just asking questions about my benefits as a concerned parent. She claimed she never actually asked for the money to be sent to her. The judge read from a transcript of one of the calls where Mom specifically said the signing bonus should be paid to her to compensate for medical expenses from my birth. Mom started crying again and said she must have been confused that day. The judge didn't look like he believed her at all. Tom got called back up to testify, and Antoine asked him to show the judge the videos he'd recorded over the years. Tom pulled out his phone with shaking hands and played 3 clips. The first one was from 2 years ago at Tom's high school graduation, where Mom had complained loudly that his ceremony was boring compared to what her modeling events used to be like. The second video showed Mom at a family dinner screaming at Tom for getting a B in chemistry and telling him he was wasting the opportunities she'd sacrificed for. The third video was from last Christmas, where Mom had spent an hour crying about how her children had ruined her body and stolen her dreams. In that video, you could hear Dad in the background telling her to calm down, but not actually doing anything to stop her. Mom's face changed while the judge watched the videos. The fake crying stopped and real anger took over. Her lawyer tried to object, saying the videos were taken out of context, but the judge overruled him and watched all 3 clips carefully. When the 3rd video finished, Mom stood up and started yelling that Tom had no right to record private family moments. Her lawyer grabbed her arm and tried to pull her back down, but she yanked away from him. The judge banged his gavel and told Mom she needed to sit down and control herself, or he'd hold her in contempt. Mom finally sat, but she was glaring at Tom with pure rage. The judge looked at her for a long moment and then started writing notes on his papers. Antoine rested our case, and the judge said he'd heard enough. He didn't even ask Mom's lawyer if he had any other witnesses. The judge took off his glasses and looked directly at Mom. He said that based on the evidence presented, he was granting a temporary restraining order. Mom had to stay at least 100 yards away from me, my apartment, and my workplace. She couldn't contact me directly by phone, email, text message, or social media. She couldn't have anyone else contact me on her behalf. The order was good for 6 months, and there would be a review hearing in November to determine if it should be extended. Mom started screaming that this was illegal and she had rights as a parent. The judge banged his gavel again and said if she didn't stop immediately, he would hold her in contempt, and she could spend the night in jail. Dad reached over and put his hand on Mom's arm, but she shook him off. The judge explained that the restraining order was necessary based on the pattern of harassment and emotional abuse documented in the evidence. He said Mom's behavior at the graduation party, combined with her attempts to interfere with my employment, showed she was unable to respect appropriate boundaries. Mom kept crying and saying this wasn't fair, but her lawyer finally got her to be quiet. The judge signed the order and handed copies to both lawyers. Antoine took ours and gave me a small nod. We stood up to leave, and Mom tried to follow us, but the bailiff stepped in front of her and reminded her the order was effective immediately. Outside the courthouse, Mom was completely losing it. She was screaming and crying, and Dad was trying to hold her up because her legs seemed to give out. We walked toward the parking lot, and Mom saw us. She started screaming across the distance that I'd ruined her life just like I ruined her body and destroyed her modeling career. Her voice was so loud that people walking into the courthouse turned to stare. Tom yelled back that she never had a modeling career, and that's when Mom lunged forward. Dad grabbed her around the waist and physically held her back while she flailed and tried to get to us. Jake put his hand on my back and steered me toward his car. I could still hear Mom screaming even after we got in and closed the doors. Jake started the engine and drove out of the parking lot while I watched Mom through the rear window. She was bent over with Dad holding her, and the 2 family friends she'd brought were standing awkwardly nearby, not knowing what to do. Tom was in his own car behind us, and he followed us back to my apartment. The whole drive I felt numb, like I was watching everything happen to someone else. My hands were shaking and I couldn't make them stop. That night, the adrenaline crash hit me hard. I sat on my couch and started crying and couldn't stop for hours. Jake held me and didn't try to make me talk or tell me it would be okay. He just sat there with his arms around me while I sobbed. Tom stayed for a while too, and we all sat together in my living room, not saying much. Eventually, Tom went home and Jake made me eat something even though I wasn't hungry. He reminded me that I'd done the right thing even though it felt terrible. He said Maeve had told me that setting boundaries with a narcissistic parent often feels like you're the bad guy because they're so good at playing the victim. I knew this was true, but it still hurt. Part of me felt like a horrible daughter for getting a restraining order against my own mother. Another part of me felt relieved that she legally couldn't show up at my apartment or my job anymore. The 2 feelings fought each other in my head and made everything worse. Jake stayed over that night, and I finally fell asleep around 3 in the morning. 2 days after the hearing, someone knocked on my apartment door. I looked through the peephole and saw Dad standing there alone. He looked awful, like he hadn't slept since the courthouse. I almost didn't let him in, but he saw my shadow through the peephole and said he just wanted to talk. I opened the door, and he came in slowly, like he was afraid I'd change my mind. He sat on my couch and put his head in his hands. He told me that after the hearing, Mom had a complete breakdown. She'd locked herself in their bedroom for a full day, and when she finally came out, she was different. He said watching her in court and seeing all the evidence laid out like that made him finally see clearly what she'd been doing to us all these years. He said he was ashamed of himself for enabling her and not protecting Tom and me. His voice cracked when he said it, and I could tell he meant it. But I also felt angry that it took a judge and legal documents for him to finally understand. I'd been trying to tell him for years that Mom's behavior wasn't normal. Dad admitted he'd been in denial about Mom's behavior because facing it would mean acknowledging he'd failed to protect his kids. He said he'd told himself that Mom was just dramatic or going through a hard time or dealing with her own childhood trauma. He said he'd made excuses for her because it was easier than confronting the problem. He told me he was moving into the guest room and he'd told Mom she had to start therapy, or he was filing for separation. He said he couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when his daughter had to get a restraining order to feel safe. I wanted to believe him, but I was cautious. Dad had promised to stand up to Mom before and never followed through. He'd say he would talk to her or set boundaries, and then a week later everything would go back to normal. I told him I appreciated what he was saying, but I needed to see his actions match his words over time. He nodded and said he understood. He asked if he could hug me, and I let him. He held on for a long time and I could feel him shaking. When he left, I felt confused about whether this was real change or just another temporary reaction. Tom and I met for coffee 3 days later at a place near campus. We sat outside even though it was hot because we both needed the noise of traffic and other people around us. Tom was more skeptical than I was about Dad's sudden revelation. He said Dad was probably just reacting to the legal consequences and the public embarrassment rather than truly understanding the problem. Tom reminded me that Dad had seen Mom's behavior for years and never did anything about it until a judge forced his hand. We talked about how weird it felt to have other people finally see what we'd been living with. The videos Tom showed in court were just a tiny sample of what Mom had put us through, but they were enough for the judge to understand. We agreed to maintain our boundaries with both parents and see if Dad's actions matched his words over time. Tom said he was definitely not going back to live at home even if Dad promised things would be different. He'd already signed a lease for next semester and he was working extra hours at his summer job to make sure he could afford it without any help from them. I told him I was proud of him and he said the same thing to me. 3 weeks after the restraining order was put in place, I got a letter delivered to my apartment. It came from Mom's lawyer's office, which meant she was following the rules about not contacting me directly. I sat on my couch staring at the envelope for 10 minutes before I opened it. The letter was 2 pages long in Mom's handwriting. It wasn't an apology exactly, but more of an explanation. She wrote about her difficult childhood with her own narcissistic mother, and how she'd never learned healthy ways to process her feelings. She said she regretted the way she'd acted at my graduation party, and the things she'd said over the years. She wrote that she'd started seeing a therapist twice a week and was working on understanding her behavior. She said she hoped that eventually we could rebuild our relationship on healthier terms. The letter talked a lot about her feelings and her struggles. It mentioned my pain only briefly at the end. I read it 3 times trying to figure out how I felt about it. Part of me wanted to believe she was really changing. Another part of me noticed that even in a letter that was supposed to be about apologizing, she'd made it mostly about herself. I showed the letter to Maeve at my next therapy session. She read it carefully, and then asked me what I thought about it. I said it seemed like progress, but something felt off. Maeve helped me see that it was a typical narcissistic non-apology. Mom acknowledged some behavior but framed herself as the victim of her own circumstances. She talked about her difficult childhood and her therapy as if those things explained away the damage she'd caused. She said she regretted things but didn't actually take full responsibility for them. The letter was carefully worded to make her seem like she was being vulnerable and accountable, while actually avoiding real accountability. Maeve said real change takes years, and I shouldn't rush to reconcile just because Mom was saying some of the right words now. She reminded me that actions matter more than words, and I should wait to see if Mom's behavior actually changed over time. I decided to keep the letter but not respond to it. I would maintain the boundaries I'd set and see what happened over the next few months. It felt like the right choice, even though part of me wanted to believe everything could be fixed quickly. The next few weeks at the hospital settled into a comfortable rhythm that felt almost strange after years of waiting for the next crisis. My supervisor pulled me aside one afternoon after I'd handled a difficult patient situation without breaking a sweat. She told me I seemed different lately, more confident and present, like I'd finally relaxed into the job instead of just surviving it. I realized she was right. Without Mom's constant emotional demands draining my energy before I even got to work, I actually had something left to give my patients. I was better at reading their needs, quicker to respond during emergencies, more patient when they were scared or confused. Jake noticed it too when I came home from shifts, actually excited to tell him about my day, instead of just collapsing on the couch. Being 22 was supposed to feel like this all along, like I had room to figure out who I was instead of spending all my energy managing someone else's feelings. The restraining order had given me something I didn't know I needed until I had it, which was space to just exist without constantly bracing for the next attack. Tom called me on a Tuesday evening sounding more animated than I'd heard him in months. He got accepted to a summer internship program in Colorado, working with a tech startup, and he was taking it even though it meant missing Dad's birthday, and some cousin's wedding Mom had been planning to attend. His voice had this lightness to it that made me realize how heavy he'd sounded before, like he'd been carrying weight I hadn't noticed until it was gone. We talked for almost an hour about how weird it felt to make decisions based on what we wanted, instead of what would keep Mom from having a meltdown. He said his therapist told him that guilt was a normal response when you start setting boundaries with a parent who trained you to prioritize their needs over your own. I admitted I still felt guilty sometimes too, like I was doing something wrong by protecting myself when actually it was the healthiest thing either of us had ever done. Tom said he wasn't coming back to live at home after the internship ended, that he'd already started looking at apartments near campus for next year. I told him I was proud of him and meant it completely. Jake and I had one of those serious conversations that you know is coming but still makes your stomach tight when it actually happens. We were sitting on my couch after dinner and he brought up how my family situation affected our relationship in ways we hadn't really discussed before. He wasn't angry or threatening to leave, just honest about needing me to keep working on my own healing so I didn't bring those patterns forward into what we were building together. He pointed out times when I'd shut down instead of communicating or assumed he was mad when he wasn't, leftover reactions from years of walking on eggshells around Mom's moods. I appreciated his honesty even though it stung a little to hear. He said he was committed to supporting me through this, but also needed me to stay committed to therapy and actually doing the work, instead of just going through the motions. That conversation motivated me to be more consistent with my appointments with Maeve, and more willing to dig into the uncomfortable stuff instead of skating around it. 4 months after the graduation party, I sat in my apartment on a Saturday morning with coffee and actual silence. The restraining order was still in place, and I'd already decided to request an extension at the review hearing next month. Mom was apparently going to therapy according to Dad's occasional updates, but I wasn't ready to test whether she'd actually changed or just learned better ways to manipulate. Tom was thriving at his internship based on his excited texts about the projects he was working on. Dad was supposedly figuring out his own issues, though I remained cautious about his follow-through. I was learning that healing from this kind of family damage didn't have a neat timeline, or a moment where everything suddenly felt fixed. Some days were still hard, and I caught myself falling into old thought patterns, hearing Mom's voice in my head telling me I was selfish or ungrateful. But I had space now to recognize those thoughts for what they were, which was her programming and not actual truth. I was building a life that felt like mine instead of a reaction to her demands. I had work I was good at, a relationship with someone who actually supported me, a brother who was finding his own path, and friends who knew the real story instead of the perfect family image Mom always insisted we project. That felt like enough for right now, which was all I could really ask for.